Did y'all know that Stephen King has a son named Joe? I'm not joking, but he is. Well, The Black Phone is now in theaters as of Friday, June 24th, 2022. You probably won't be seeing this until at least a few days later, but that's okay. The wonderful thing about YouTube is that all of my amazing horror-related videos are permanently archived for you to binge watch whenever the mood strikes you. But since one of what promises to be the biggest horror movies of the year, or at least of the summer, is out in theaters now, I figured it would be a good idea and a good time to do another installment of my book versus film comparisons. And that's because, though I don't know if everyone knows this or not, The Black Phone isn't an original screenplay, but is based on the short story of the same title by none other than Joe Hill. So that's our topic for today. We're comparing the movie that just came out to the short story to see where they're the same, where they're different, and so forth. To begin with, in case any of you don't know, Joe Hill's full name is actually Joseph Hillstrom King, and he's the son of none other than Stephen King, although he's now quite an accomplished horror author in his own right, with such titles under his belt as The Heart-Shaped Box, Horns, which was adapted as a film starring Daniel Radcliffe in 2014, the Lock and Key graphic novel series, which Netflix recently brought to life, and of course the short story collection we'll be discussing in a moment. The reason he writes under the name Joe Hill instead of using his actual last name King is because he wanted to succeed on his own merits rather than being judged, whether for better or for worse, as the son of Stephen King. And though now the cat's out of the bag, I actually give him credit for that. Though, if we're completely honest, even if the readers didn't initially know who he was still certainly able to capitalize on his father's knowledge and connections in the publishing industry early in his career. As for The Black Phone, it's a short story of about 20 pages in length, which can be found in Joe Hill's first short story collection, 20th Century Ghosts, which came out back in 2005. The short story originally appeared in issue 39 of The Third Alternative back in 2004. With regard to the collection of short stories, I was recently wandering around one of my local bookstores and I found a book entitled The Black Phone by Joe Hill. It turns out that it's none other than this very same collection, originally called 20th Century Ghosts, but it's been retitled as a movie tie-in. Personally, I don't much care for that. Now, I understand putting out a new edition with the movie's poster or the lead actor's portrait on the cover, but I really don't like this business of changing the title. I think that gets confusing for readers. However, both editions of the book are still available, and the contents are the same, including the introduction by Christopher Golden. As I always do, I'll be leaving links down in the What's It in case you want to check out copies of either version of the book for yourself. In fact, I always make sure to leave some good information down there for you, so be sure to check it out. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of my other videos. There are some good ones in the works and you're not going to want to miss them. But getting back to the book, in addition to that introduction by Christopher Golden that I already mentioned, the collection includes 15 short stories, of which The Black Phone is the 7th in the book. In preparation for seeing the movie and making this video, I took the liberty of rereading the story so it would be fresh in my mind. From this point on, I need to discuss some details of the story. Now, the way I'm going to do it is to discuss the plot minimally first, and then to delve into more detailed spoilers later. The way I'm going to do it is based on the movie's trailer. From this point on, I'm going to openly discuss information up to and including anything that you'll see in the trailer, which actually does give away a bit more than I wish it had, and that's a topic that I could rant about on another day, but I will save any spoilers beyond that trailer for later in the video. So, with that warning out of the way, and trusting that everyone still watching doesn't care if I spoil as much as the trailer did, let's get right into it. The premise of both the short story and the film is that the main character, a young boy named Finney, is abducted by a serial kidnapper and presumably murderer. But the black phone of the title is a non-functional telephone that allows Finney to receive messages from the grabber's former victims, who help him attempt to survive the ordeal and eventually attempt to escape. That part is exactly the same in both the story and the film. It differs only in the most minor of details. For example, in the story, the grabber is identified as a grotesquely obese man named Al, whereas in the movie, he's a mask-wearing maniac never given a name other than the grabber. And in the movie, he's portrayed by Ethan Hawke, who is, let's just say, not grotesquely overweight, so they're rather different in appearance. The mask itself is quite distinctive in the film, and it serves to give the grabber a certain level of character, whereas the story omits the mask entirely. And there are other little inconsequential differences as well. For example, Finney's sister is named Susanna in the story, but that's changed to Gwen in the movie. And there's a character in the story named Frank whose name is changed to Max in the movie. I'm not going to tell you too much about who Frank is, or Max is, because that's a little bit of a spoiler, but suffice it to say that the name change is the biggest substantial difference with regard to this particular character. Although I will say he's given a bit more time in the spotlight in the movie rather than in the story, although in that case not by all that much. And actually, aside from some stuff we're going to get to in a spoiler section, that's actually the biggest distinction between the story and the movie. The movie takes a lot more time to establish characters and some of the subplots than the story does. It's the exact opposite of the way things usually go. Most often, when somebody takes a novel and adapts it to the screen, a lot of details get left out. But in this case, writer-director Scott Derrickson took a mere 20 pages of short story and actually expanded them into a more substantial tale for the screen. For example, the short story actually opens with Finney's abduction. That's page 1, and it comes like a thief in the night without any sort of warning or preamble. The film takes its time to establish the characters a lot more and make us actually care about their lives a bit before turning everything upside down for them. Finney in the story is just a young boy, but in the film we learn more details about his relationship with his sister. We learn that he's horribly bullied both at school and, in a sense, by a somewhat abusive and alcoholic father. The father's story is all but absent from the short story. The rest of the differences, though, require a bit more in the way of spoilers. So before we get to an all-out spoiler section, let me just offer some general thoughts about the overall quality of the story and the movie. The story is pretty good, but it's really just the skeleton of the tale. It gives us all the information we need to get the gist of what happens, but it didn't hit me quite as hard as it could have. Partly, I think that's because it comes in the middle of an excellent collection and ends up being overshadowed by some of the other tales, but also partly I think it's just that 20 pages or so is only enough to give the most important details of the story without really taking the time to establish the characters at any length. This is, therefore, actually one of those rare cases in which I think the movie is better than the source material. Usually the books are better, but usually the reason I like the books more than the movies is because something like a 300 or 500 page novel simply has richer and more detailed storytelling than a movie of maybe 2 hours. There's a rule in screenwriting that 1 page of a script should usually be equivalent to about 1 minute of screen time. Of course, that doesn't hold perfectly when comparing a book or a story to a movie, but I think it's still sort of in the ballpark. So a 20-page story might contain the equivalent of a 20-minute movie, or maybe we should say somewhere between a 10 and 30-minute movie. But in this case, those 20 pages were expanded into nearly 2 hours, so a lot of new information was added. Very little of it came from nowhere, but while the story merely hints at some of the things, the movie takes the time to actually explore them. At the end of the day, I think The Black Phone is a more than passable story, but I think it might be one of the summer's highlights when it comes to cinematic horror. To fully understand the differences between the two, though, we do need to get into spoiler territory, and it's to that portion of our discussion that we now turn. If you've either read the story or seen the movie, I don't think you'll be particularly bothered by these spoilers, even if you haven't yet experienced the other format. But if you've neither read nor seen it, you might want to do so before you continue. As I said, these videos are permanently archived here on YouTube, so there's going to be more than ample opportunity for you to go watch the movie or go read the story, and then just make sure you come back for the rest of my discussion after you do so. And with that out of the way, let's get right into the spoiler territory. Honestly, like I said, the movie is pretty faithful to the story, but probably the biggest difference is how they treat the storyline involving Finney's sister. I already mentioned that her name changes from Susanna to Gwyn, and honestly I don't really understand why they chose to change some of the character names, but the differences don't end with just the names. In the story, she's only mentioned briefly when Finney imagines that she's engaging in some kind of semi-psychic search for his whereabouts. Through the phone, a ghost confirms that at least part of this imagined story was true, but that subplot never really goes anywhere. It's just mentioned in passing. In the movie, though, a lot of screen time is devoted to Gwyn's psychic search for her brother. It begins simply by establishing the relationship between these two children, and it even includes a subplot involving their alcoholic father's abusive reaction to Gwyn's alleged psychic abilities. But more importantly, a lot of screen time is dedicated to Gwyn and her attempts to mine her psychic dreams for information that could lead to Finney's rescue. She even finds herself working, however informally, with a couple of sympathetic police officers throughout the film, whereas the police are entirely absent from the short story. Meanwhile, the film devotes the other half or so of its time to Finney and his conversations with the various ghosts through the black telephone. Each spirit of one of the grabber's previous victims provides some key piece of information that helps Finney stay alive longer, ultimately building up to his final escape attempt. In the story, there's only one such phone call, so the movie takes its time to really build on this idea and take what exists basically just as an idea in the story and turn it into more of a complete story arc. However, despite the different handling of both the sisters' rescue mission and the number of ghostly phone calls, the story ends pretty much the same way. With the help of the ghost or ghosts, Finney manages to kill the grabber and escape just after the grabber kills his own brother, Frank or Max, for having ventured into the basement and discovering Finney's holding cell. Even Finney's method of escape is basically the same. He stuffs the phone receiver with dirt or sand to give it more weight, and then he beats the grabber with it. The movie expands upon the scene a bit with more details, but that's really the fundamental idea in both print and on screen. And actually, I think that's a bit of a shared plot hole in both versions, because in both versions of the story, Finney has access to a toilet in his cell. I can't quite imagine why he'd use a telephone as a weapon when he could instead take a good swing at his captor with the porcelain lid of the toilet tank. That is a much heavier item with which to do a lot more damage, though of course it doesn't have the dramatic oomph of using the very same telephone through which he got those ghostly messages. So I guess it just traded a little bit of realism for a bit of narrative satisfaction. But, though that is a little bit suspicious, I have to say it's not a big deal because it doesn't really affect the outcome. Whether he swings a phone or swings a toilet lid doesn't really matter. Ultimately, I have to say I'm pretty happy with both versions, and the movie maybe even a bit more so than the short story. Mostly that's just because the movie does take the time to really establish the sisters' search for Finney, because that ends up being just an odd throwaway line in the story. But also because the movie takes the time to really give the ghosts their due, allowing each of them a moment to have a phone call with Finney instead of just one of them. Even Ethan Hawke's character as the grabber is a bit more developed in the film. Part of that may be the strength of his performance, but part of it is also assuredly the creepy mask, or rather the set of masks that the costume department gave him. Even more importantly, though, we get additional little hints of his motivation, namely that he's playing a game of punishing so-called naughty boys who don't follow his rules. I guess this is just what happens when you start with raw material from somebody as creative as Joe Hill, and then trust the adaptation to a master like Scott Derrickson. If you enjoyed this discussion, do be sure to leave me a like and share this video far and wide. Even more importantly, be sure to stick around for more spooky awesomeness in my next video. Until then, take care and stay scared.